Welcome to the Wild Isle writing lecture series, The Philosophy of Writing, where I'm going to teach you about the philosophical or objective roots of the rules of writing, grammar, syntax, and style that your teachers could not teach you because they didn't know about them in all likelihood. But before we begin, we'll do a little bit of an introduction. In fact, this lecture is a preliminary lecture. We're not going to really talk about writing at all because we have to understand what we mean by philosophy before we can understand the meaning of the philosophy of writing. So, all right, so the much needed introduction. I wanted to ask my audience here, what do you guys think philosophy is? To begin with, because people use that word all the time, right? Like, well, this is my philosophy, or like the philosophy of this is, but I find that almost no one actually knows what that word means. They just kind of use it and bandy it about. So, philosophy is.
It's kind of like hypothetically?
Is sort of maybe, so a hypothetical, right? Making hypotheses is part and parcel of what it means to do philosophy, but a hypothesis itself isn't philosophy, because otherwise what we would say is because a hypothesis is like a guess, right? Or an educated guess, really, but nonetheless, we wouldn't say that every educated guess is a philosophy unless we wanted to explore the word. Any other definitions, philosophy, what you think of?
Is it the study in pursuit of truth?
Study and pursuit of truth. Yes, actually, that would be what philosophy is, but it's you have to break that down too, right? Study and pursuit of truth, because then all of a sudden we have a bunch of questions like, what does it mean to study or pursue truth, and then what is truth? And we'll get into that as we break down our definition. Go ahead to the next slide. All right, so before we begin, so I was reading through the Analects, actually preparing for these lectures, and I came across this quote by Confucius. And almost no one reads the Confucian writings, actually, so you hardly actually get any of the good wisdom, because most of it's boring. But Confucius had said, learning without thought is labor lost. Thought without learning is perilous. And I thought that this really spoke to the value of philosophy, because most people, when they think of philosophy, is like, why do I care? Like, what use of this is this to me in my everyday life? Like, I go about all the time not knowing anything about all this philosophy garbage. So what do we think that Confucius is getting at here, right? So let's do this in two parts. Learning without thought is labor lost. What does that mean? So learning without thought, what does it mean to learn without thought?
Wasting time.
Well, ultimately, yeah, right? So is labor lost. So you are wasting your time. But what are we wasting our time doing? Learning without thought. What is that?
It's like blindly following something.
Yeah, blindly following something. So we're just imbibing information. So this is kind of the, if you watch the news, what it becomes, you pay attention to how you're being treated. Like, pretend like this is an actual person talking to you, and you'll notice right away there, or a school teacher for that matter, or a college professor. All of these people in, let's say, positions of relative authority, what they're doing when they're talking to you is treating you like a child, in which they are going to merely, by merely I mean only, without doing other things, input information into you. Like, I am the bearer of the truth, I now tell you the truth, now you know what to believe. So if you learn something without actually thinking about it, or perhaps the word scrutinizing it, then you've now wasted your time, because there's no reason to believe that what you've actually just taken in is true or false. You have no method of analysis there. And that's why thought without learning is perilous, because now you've now incorporated that information into yourself, but you have no means of separating the wheat from the chaff. You don't know what's true or false. And so now you're going about the world believing that you're correct, right? Well, what if you're wrong about the fact you're about to walk off a cliff, right? Or what if you're wrong about the fact that you're able to, I don't know, mediate certain behaviors? Like, that can put you in a bad place pretty fast, right? Like, oh no, I can have just like 2 tortilla chips, and then you have the whole bowl of tortilla chips, and then you do that day after day after day, and then, you know, that doesn't end well for you, right? So that's the value of philosophy, is being able to scrutinize the information being given to you, be able to be able to actually pursue what is true, to have a methodology and means of testing. This is where the hypothesis definition kind of comes into play, where a hypothesis is useful because you can test it. So go to the next slide. So we've already covered a little bit of this, and I do this throughout these lectures. I cover a vulgar definition of a word and then what I call the philosophical definition, and we'll get into coming to valid definitions in the next presentation when we start talking about language. But for now, we'll take it for it is. So we've seen a bit of this. So the particular doctrines relating to these issues of some specific individual or school, right? So that's kind of like a dogma. A doctrine is how people usually use the word philosophy. We just discussed that that's absolutely not what philosophy is, because that's the opposite, right? That's the unscrutinizing, like, okay, well, here's a set of prescripts, and you just, like, you think what these prescripts say because that's what it says. That's not thinking, right? That's learning without thinking. It's exactly what we just had Confucius tell us not to do, which is funny because then Confucius would probably say, and also I'm the master, so you listen to what I say. Turns out a lot of philosophers are also hypocrites. So it's not that. Any system of belief, values, or tenets, which is really just a shorthand, a low-resolution way of saying the same thing that the prior definition said, a personal outlook or viewpoint. You'll hear this a lot, right, when people talk about philosophy. Like, that's my philosophy. What they're saying is, like, that's my opinion, man. I hate that. And every time you hear someone suggest a thing, think that in that little intonation, man, like, you're just trying to keep me down. It's like, well, dude, no, like, maybe nature and the universe is trying to keep you down, and for good reason. Like, maybe you're not fit for this world. I don't know. But no, philosophy is absolutely not that which is personal to you, because that which is personal to you, we encounter an oxymoron. If any of you follow my little Wild Isle aphorisms, one of them is called oxymoronic, right? Which is a way of taking the word oxymoron, which means like paradox, and then making it into like a very poignant insult, essentially. But the idea that, like, you could have your truth, that doesn't make sense, right? Because truth, the meaning of that word is something separate from you that persists outside your preference for it, or even your experience of it, right? Like, it makes no sense to say, well, it's your truth that the door is closed, but my truth that the door is open. Because, like, either you can go through the open doorway or it's not open, and you won't go through it. And it doesn't make any sense unless, you know, one person did somehow go through it and the other person just didn't, but that's not the world we live in. So let's go on to a better definition of philosophy. Before we do that, we've gone backwards, forward. There we go, philosophorum, right? So the etymology of the word philosophy comes from philo, which means love in Greek, and then sophia, which means wisdom. So philosophy is really the love of wisdom, right? And we talk about the pursuit of truth. It is the rational investigation of the truth. Rational. What does rational mean, my audience? Anyone want to take a guess? Rational. Nobody?
Logical?
Logical, yeah. I would say it's essentially synonymous with logical, but then that begs the question, even though I think technically begging the question is something else, but I'll use that term anyway. What is logical then? Right?
What's thought by most? Or?
Definitely not what's thought by most, right? So for two reasons that are kind of funny. One is that most people are not logical. Like, they do things that are what are called non sequiturs. Like, they do not follow from one another. They are, as Jonathan Haidt points out, if you ever read The Righteous Mind, people do these post hoc rationalizations all the time. So they'll do something, they don't really know why they did it, and they won't think about it until you ask them to justify it. And if you keep doing it to somebody, what you'll find is they'll start coming up with, here's what I'm trying to get into, self-contradictory reasons for why they did an action. The more you push them, because they're making up the reasons after the fact. This is Jonathan Haidt came with this idea of the elephant and the elephant rider, right? So you are most of you, what makes you up is the elephant, and then there's a tiny part of you that thinks it's like the master, and it's your ego, and that's the elephant rider. If you know anything about what happens when, like, an elephant like say you have a war elephant and you're a part of, I don't know, Hannibal's army, and you're trying to get over this mountain, but then the elephant panics on this like mountain ridge, and you're supposed to be the guy in control of it. What happens when the elephant panics on the mountain ridge? You go over the edge. It doesn't matter. You're tiny. The elephant's huge. You can yank on the reins all you want. You can poke and prod it. It's going to do what it's going to do. And mostly, we are that rider on top of the elephant, rationalizing, right? Rationalizing, or another aphorism I have is irrationalizing, which is not only coming up with something that does not follow, but is in direct opposition to the conclusions that we've reached. But now I've gone far in the field. So what rational means is it coheres with itself. Essentially, logic is kind of the same thing, which means that we are obeying a rule of not contradicting ourselves, not believing two things at the same time. You can't believe at the same time because they can't be true simultaneously. That's what rational means. And when we're doing a rational or logical investigation of the truth, we're trying to find the truth by means of not contradicting ourselves. And that might sound kind of highbrow, but once we get into some of our examples, it'll become a little clearer. So we'll go ahead onward. Okay, what is wisdom? This is a little bit from the dialogues of Socrates. I'll read through it rather quickly and then discuss its significance. This is something I added in later, but I think it helps. So this is Socrates talking right now. He says, "After the politicians, I went to the poets. Accordingly, I took them some of the most elaborate passages in their own writings and asked what was the meaning of them, thinking that they would teach me something. Will you believe me? I'm almost ashamed to confess the truth, but I must say that there is hardly a person present who would not have talked better about their poetry than they did themselves. Then I knew that not by wisdom do poets write poetry, but by a sort of genius and inspiration. They are like diviners or soothsayers who also say many fine things, but do not understand the meaning of them." Remember I just talked about the elephant and the elephant rider and rationalizations? That's what Socrates is saying about the poets. He was, in a previous passage, essentially saying the same thing about politicians, that they're all post hoc liars. They don't know what they're doing. They, like, in a burst of genius, or for most of us, in a kind of sleepwalking state where we just kind of sleepwalk through life. We're not aiming. We're saying that there's a fallacy called Texas sharpshooter, where you shoot a barn a bunch of times and then you go and draw the bullseye around where you shot. That's what people are mostly doing, right? And that is not wisdom. It's kind of the opposite of wisdom. I wanted to throw that in there. We'll go to the next slide. It'll actually answer our question, right? Knowledge, belief, and opinion. So we're trying to understand, let's say, how we can use, let's say, not contradicting ourselves, rationality to get to the truth. To understand that, you have to have good definitions, and the three I'll talk about today, I'll try to be a little quick about this, are knowledge, belief, and opinion. I hate the word opinion, by the way. Like, I want to rip it out of people's mouths as they're saying it, and you'll understand why. So most people, I'm going to read through these three definitions, and audience, I want you to pay attention to a problem that should poke out at you when I read through these. So we'll start with knowledge, what most people think of knowledge, right? Acquaintance or familiarity gained by experience, the perception of the fact. Belief, an opinion or conviction, trust or confidence. Opinion, a belief or judgment, a personal view. So, is there any problem with these three words that you might notice when you put them all together? Sometimes these are okay by themselves. Like belief, well, depends. Actually, I kind of hate the first little chunk of belief there. But trust or confidence seems fine, right? Opinion, judgment, that seems okay. Knowledge, familiarity gained by experience. But nothing wrong there, right? Anyone pick out the flaw, the problem? There's a concept I call a lateral slide. The technical term for it is an equivocation. You might also hear it called double speech. But the problem is that each of these definitions contains a component of each other. And what that means is, in your head, as you're using them, or if you're listening to someone else say them, or as you're saying them, what you can very easily do is blur them in your thoughts. So you might use the word belief, but in your head it means opinion. You might say opinion, you mean belief. And then maybe if you believe a thing, you confuse that with knowledge at the same time, because their definitions are kind of overlapping, right? So if you have a strong conviction of a thing and confidence of it because it's what you perceive, then you kind of perceive that as a fact, and that's your personal view, right? That's what you believe, that's what you judge is the case. So therefore, like, what's the difference between opinion, belief, and knowledge? Nothing really. So if it's my opinion, I believe it and it's true, right? I had a friend who used to irritate me. I shouldn't say his name, so I won't. But he used to come up to me and say, "I feel, therefore it is." And that's essentially what people are doing when you have these blurry definitions. So we're going to come up with better ones. So go ahead to the next slide. Okay, you'll notice a difference with these. Knowledge, a justified true belief. So knowledge is a form of belief, right? Meaning it's a subset of belief, but it's one that is justified and true. Meaning it is in fact the case, and also the way that you got there was valid. Right? So if you happen to luckily guess a thing, you don't know it, right? Like if you don't know the code to a safe, but if you happen to believe that it's like some set of digits and you try it, and it in fact is that, and the safe opens, you could lie to someone and say, "Hey, I knew the code all along." It's like, no, you didn't know it, you guessed it, right? So for it to be knowledge, you have to believe it. It has to be true, and the way that you came to that true belief has to be some valid means of knowing. Like if you spied on the guy who opened it before and wrote down all the numbers, and then you could say, well, I watched a guy open it with this combination, so I have reason to believe that that's knowledge, right? Belief, principle, proposition, idea, etc., accepted as true, right? I believe the sun will come out tomorrow. The example I always gave with this when I taught this in my university lectures on argumentative essays. I don't actually know the sun is going to come out tomorrow. Like if it's supernovaed right now, I'd have 8 minutes before the light could stop getting here or get here in a giant spark of light, and then we'd all be incinerated by the heat that would come after the light. So I don't actually know that. I have reason to believe it. It's a reasonable belief, but it is a statement of confidence, right? If I believe that I'm going to be woken up by my alarm, like you might not. It might be reasonable to believe the alarm is going to wake you up, and you think it's true, but you think it's true in a kind of gambler's sense. And then opinion. I'm going to relegate opinion to where it belongs, which is an evaluation, impression, or estimation, judgment, you could use the word, of the value or worth of a person or thing, right? So something you prefer is what your opinion is. If you use, like I beg you all, stop using the word opinion to refer to what you believe is true. Like if you say like, well, these are my I don't know, political opinions, like stop, because what you're saying is this is just what I like, and then that just invites the other person to say, well, this is just what I like. You might as well just be screaming at one another and then get into a fist fight. Like it's not useful. You don't have political opinions, like you have beliefs, and are your beliefs justified? Do you actually know anything? Then you can have a conversation. But until we get rid of this blurriness, we can't pursue the truth rationally without contradicting ourselves, because all we're going to do when it boils all the way down to opinion is just state our subjective preferences, and we're not going to get anywhere, and we're not going to be able to learn about the philosophy of writing, because it's just going to be your opinion, man, and that is not useful for anyone. Go to the next slide. All right, so we're going to start off, we kind of started off with Socrates a little bit, but Descartes covers some of the groundwork that Socrates covers, so we'll get into here in a moment. We'll read quite a lot, actually, from his meditations, his first meditation, about what we're doing. And really, it's applying a lens of skepticism to our knowledge. We're not assuming things. That's like the first thing we need to do, because as soon as we start assuming things, we get into trouble, and Descartes will tell us why. So, he says, "How often have I had an experience like this? While sleeping at night, I am convinced that I am here, dressed in a robe and seated by the fire, when in fact I am lying between the covers with my clothes off." So go to the next slide. This is long, he talks for a while. "At the moment my eyes are certainly wide awake, and I am looking at this piece of paper. This head which I am moving is not asleep, and I am aware of this hand as I move it consciously and purposefully. None of that happens while I'm asleep. None of what happens while I'm asleep is so distinct." Right, so he's saying like, okay, well, like, look, I've had dreams where I think I'm awake, but now that I'm awake, I can definitely tell that I'm not asleep. It's a different experience. So yes, of course, as if I do not recall other times when I too have not been deceived by similar thoughts in my sleep. So his reassurance that, like, okay, well, I've been tricked in my dreams, but now it really doesn't feel like I'm dreaming, but also when I was dreaming the last time, I thought the same thing, right? Am I in the Matrix? I don't know. That essentially, the Matrix had not come out yet in, I think, like 1614 is when he wrote this, so he couldn't make the reference, but that's his idea, that he's questioning, how much do I really know? On to the next one. As I reflect on this matter carefully, it becomes completely clear to me that there are no certain indicators which ever enable us to differentiate between being awake and being asleep, so much so that I am astounded, and this confused state itself almost convinces me that I may be sleeping. So this is the groundwork for what we're doing when we're going to approach our philosophy of writing, is to realize that what we are convinced of, what seems to be intuitive, often is not the case. You have to start out questioning what you know and then work from there, because if you start out with presuppositions, you're going to end up in trouble, because you're going to assume things that you're not aware that you're assuming. And remember, we're trying to do a rational pursuit of truth, so we can't contradict ourselves. But you don't know if you've contradicted yourself if you don't even know the ground on which you stand. If you don't know what you're assuming coming in, it's called an axiom, by the way. If you don't understand what you're assuming coming into any of your beliefs, you might have a bunch of contradictory beliefs that you're just not thinking about because you haven't considered why you believe anything you believe. And so the same thing is true of writing. If you want to be a better writer, better reader, better communicator, you have to understand why you are, let's say, coming to that process with certain ideas and whether they're valid or invalid. Let's go to the next one. I threw this in here. I'm not going to dwell on this because we'll cover it more later. But I wanted to talk about these words, phenomena and noumena, because I'll end up using them out of utility. Quickly, this is Immanuel Kant, by the way. He was like essentially an autistic German midget who was also kind of a weird occult sorcerer, his trying to know the mind of God. We're not talking about that. We're talking about his ideas of phenomena and noumena. So phenomena, we use that word all the time, like, oh, it's such a phenomenon, right? That is the world as we can experience it, to put it shortly, and I won't go beyond that. The noumena is the world as it is, aside from how you experience it. So you can have experiences of the world that are false, and what actually is the noumena. Does that make sense, everybody? So phenomena is the world as you experience it, which is prone to error and prone to subjectivity. And the noumena is the world as you can't experience it and isn't prone to error and will correct you when your, let's say, phenomenology is incorrect. Whatever some French phenomenologists say about it, they're wrong. We'll go on to the next slide. So we've kind of arrived at this this position from which you really should start from if you're doing philosophy. Philosophy is the thing that it's the level of wisdom, but the process of doing it is that pursuit, and that's epitomized with Socrates, which you can kind of consider like the grandfather of all philosophy. And I'm the wisest man alive, for I know one thing, and that is I know nothing. Which was a consequence of him going to the Oracle of Delphi, and essentially like a prophetess in Greece. And she's like, Socrates, you're the smartest guy there is in town. And he's like, what are you talking about? I'm like a homeless retired soldier with a bunch of vices. And so he goes all over Athens and then finds out all of these people are just like BSing me about everything that they know. And then when he realizes, oh, I know why I'm the smartest guy, because they all think they know things, and they don't realize they actually know almost next to nothing. I'm the only one who knew that I was dumb, right? But the thing is, Socrates could start to learn things from that position, whereas other people would take what they thought they knew and thought they understood, and not be able to correct themselves and not able to learn anything. And when we go to apply this to writing, that's super important, because you might think like, oh, I know how to write a letter or write an essay. I've done this 100 times. Like maybe you've done it a bunch of times really badly and you're not able to get any better at it or understand how bad you are. If like you're a novelist listening to this online, and this is more an academic just leave Confucius. That's another Confucius, probably more realistic. Confucius a little tubbier. But if you are a novelist online and you don't know how bad you are, it's probably because you're assuming that you're doing things right that you're not, or if you're getting bad marks if you're in Britain and you're in university, right? So what does Confucius have to say here? Shall I teach you what knowledge is? When you know a thing, to hold that you know it. And when you do not know a thing, to allow that you do not know it. This is knowledge. It's the same idea, right? It's like admit when you don't know things. That is like those are the first steps to knowledge. Go ahead to the next slide. It's just a little tidbit by Confucius. Also, let's see, what's our time? Oh, is it already past 6? All right, no, we're fine. So we're going to go over the allegory of the cave. You guys familiar with this? You ever heard of Plato's allegory of the cave? I'm getting some nods, some shaking heads. It's rather long, so I'll get started on it, and then I'll ask you what you think it means at the end. So, again, in the mouth of Socrates. We actually don't have anything written down by Socrates. I don't even know that Socrates could write. But one of his students, Plato, supposedly wrote down a bunch of stuff. I've read the dialogues of Socrates. There's some things I believe Socrates did probably say, and some things that Plato definitely put in there. We talk about Zhuangzi. He'll talk all about that. But Socrates. And now allow me to draw a comparison in order to understand the effect of learning, or lack thereof, upon our nature. Imagine that there are people living in a cave deep underground. The cavern has a mouth that opens to the light above, and a passage exists from this all the way down to the people. They have lived here from infancy, with their legs and necks bound in chains. They cannot move. All they can do is stare directly forward, as the chains stop them from turning their heads around. Imagine that far above and behind them blazes a great fire. Between this fire and the captives, a low partition is erected along a path, something like puppeteers used to conceal themselves during their shows. And in case the language is losing you, we've got guys strapped down to like posts or chairs or something. They're forced to stare at a wall. There's a light that's a big fire behind them, and a shadow puppetry is being done behind them. So, a partition so that people can shine or put things in front of the fire, and they can see the shadows cast on the wall. By the way, the Greeks, they typically did these things in dialogue, so there's people talking. That's how they frame their argument. So Glaucon, who's a infamous skeptic, is like, okay, I can picture it. Socrates continues, look, and you will also see other people carrying objects back and forth along the partition. Things of every kind, images of people and animals, carved in stone and wood and other materials. Some of these other people speak, while others remain silent. Glaucon says, a bizarre situation for some unusual captives. So we are, right? So that should hint to you that this is an allegory. Now, tell me if you suppose it's possible that these captives ever saw anything of themselves or one another, other than the shadows flitting across the cavern wall before them. Glaucon responds, certainly not, for they are restrained all their lives, with their heads facing only forward. Go ahead to the next slide. And Socrates responds, and that would be just as true for the objects moving to and fro behind them? Certainly. Now, if they could speak, would you say that these captives would imagine that the names they gave to the things they were able to see applied to real things? And Glaucon admits it would have to be so. So if in case that lost you, what Socrates is saying there is like, what they are calling the shadows they believe to be the things. They've never known that their object, there's like a light. They don't know about the partition. They don't know about the people talking. They think the voices and the shadows are the things, right? And Glaucon's like, well, yeah, because they haven't ever seen anything else. And if a sound reverberated through their cavern from one of those others passing behind the partition, do you suppose that the captives would think anything but the passing shadow was really all that made the sound? No, by Zeus. Well then, undoubtedly, such captives would consider the truth to be nothing but the shadows of the carved objects. So it's from Plato's Republic. Now another piece to that story as you go on, which we won't cover here because I don't know that it's quite relevant. But what does that mean? What's the point of talking about these guys strapped to chairs who are only staring at the wall, who think the entire world and all the speech for the people for the petition are just the shadows? Any guesses? What is this?
People's truth is based off of their perception if they're not doing philosophy.
Okay, so our answer was truth. Their idea of what the truth is based purely on their perception, because they've not been able to do any investigation or philosophy. They've just known the shadows. Yeah. Remember our definitions of knowledge, belief, and opinion. Which one does that fit into?
Opinion?
In a sense, yes, because they only have their judgments. Like, they have no way of checking what they believe, so they've just got their sense impressions, their subjectivity. And you'll notice in the middle of that, Socrates is like, oh, well, as we are. He's saying that at least the people of Athens and people at large are mostly the prisoners who never bother to look. And what that means is that they're going about their lives believing in shadow puppets. And again, coming back to writing, if you don't think that skill is important, perhaps it's because you've never paid attention to what the skill is. And I don't know if I go ahead to the next slide and see if I cover this there. Go back. Nietzsche, no, backwards. Nietzsche deserves his own little thing, and I won't go too long with Nietzsche. But I will take a small aside for this. So I believe, won't claim to know that writing is thinking. And that actually, when you can't write, you actually can't think. What you think is thinking is something more approximating dreaming. The reason that I think that is, let's go back to Descartes for a second. Like, when you're dreaming, it makes sense to you, and you can't really distinguish it usually from real life. And once you can, that almost always wakes you up, right? Except for some lucid dreamers. But when you wake up and you think about your dream, there's usually a bunch of holes, like things that made sense at the time in the dream for some reason, but now just don't. Your thoughts are not different than the dream, right? Because we might think we think in pictures or words. You don't, because there's no pictures or words in your head, right? You have impressions in your head, and you kind of know that because you go to write down, let's say, a paragraph or an essay or a full-out idea that seems to make sense in your head, and then all of a sudden it's really hard to get it out. And that's the way we talk about it, right? Get it out. No. It's not there. What you're running into actually is the fact that you haven't thought it through at all. There are so many holes in this thing that when you go to write it down, you realize, oh, wait a minute, I don't know what I'm doing. I think I do because I'm the elephant rider, and the elephant says, I definitely, this is the right way to go. And then they're like, yeah, of course it is, and of course I know how. And then you go to do it and you can't. Same thing when you go to paint a portrait. If you have not practiced learning what an image is, what makes up an image, you can't do it, right? Like, let's say if I could magically give you the dexterity to operate the paintbrush, you don't have the knowledge, right? The idea is malformed. The image in your mind is not the real image. And in the same way, your thoughts are the shadows on the wall. Your thoughts are the shadows on the wall. It's not just what you believe, it's what is going on in your head. That's why this is so important, because you actually, if you can't learn to write, you can't learn to think. And if you can't learn to think, then you're pretending that you're in control, when really, as much as we can be in control of our lives, we're actually just kind of coasting along, allowing other unseen forces to push you around because you're not paying any attention, right? Because you're not able to, able to notice that maybe even some of those external forces are you, but that's getting way too far into it. So let's go to Nietzsche. So this made me laugh when I first read it. Supposing that truth is a woman, what then? Go on, because he goes on for a while. Is there not ground for suspecting that all philosophers, insofar as they have been dogmatists, have failed to understand women. That the terrible seriousness and clumsy inopportunity with which they have usually paid their address to truth have been unskilled and unseemly methods for winning a woman. Go to the next one. Certainly, she has never allowed herself to be won, and at present every kind of dogma stands with sad and discouraged mien, if indeed it stands at all. Anyone know what Nietzsche just said?
I think he's trying to say well, I think he's saying a lot of things, but I think one is he's saying that the understanding of logical outcomes in the world don't necessarily equip you that well to function in the world.
So the logical outcomes don't equip you to function. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, like so for example, like the female archetype being something that operates more off of emotion, whereas in this philosopher's like conception of like logic, right? So the philosopher tries to like woo the woman and just fails miserably, even though he's so logical, because he doesn't actually understand what he's trying to do. He doesn't understand the game he's playing. That's the best interpretation I can come up for now, but I think it's like a misunderstanding of the rules, sort of.
Yeah, so because the lapel mic might not pick all of that up, summarize it very quickly. You might think that your logic is impressive and perfect and great and gets you to the truth, but that doesn't do you any good when, let's say, pursuing a thing that itself probably doesn't obey your logic. That's the key here. So if truth is like a woman and like you think that you've got everything figured out and you try to woo the woman and like you don't know what you're doing and you kind of fall flat on your face because you're wrong. And it's not what coheres to the truth in the same way. It's not what's going to impress the woman that the philosophers are metaphorically trying to woo. And so what Nietzsche is kind of pointing out there is that even if it seems to you that you have a coherent stream of thoughts, you probably don't, right? Like your thoughts might sequence one to the other, to the other, to the other. They might follow from one to the other. But like how many of your premises, how many of your ideas or beliefs are false in there? And you only need one, by the way. I don't know if you don't know how terrible this is, but if you start from one false premise, one false idea, everything that follows, no matter how much logical sense it makes, no matter how much it doesn't contradict itself, is almost invariably wrong. Okay? And coming back to writing, it helps to see that because when you go to write it down, you have to write down all the steps. And then you have the steps there, and you can see as they follow from one another. Okay, that's good. But as Nietzsche is saying, like then you have to look are any of these actually true? Can I verify any of these are true? Let me go back to Descartes. Like, I don't know. Because I don't even know, let's say, really when I'm awake, when I'm asleep. I don't know what is exactly real or what is a shadow on the wall. And we kind of encounter this kind of hyper-skepticism. And again, I used that word at the beginning of the lecture, and we're kind of rounding back to it. So what is philosophy? Philosophy is an attitude we've gotten so far, an attitude of skepticism toward what we know. And we apply it to writing as a kind of, let's say, trial. I actually think, I look at the word etymology of the word essay, and it is like to weigh or to try, right? Like put on trial, what I mean to try. So to assume like your thoughts might be wrong, and you actually have to keep testing them. Your beliefs are probably wrong, and you have to keep testing them, and you write them out so that you can see what they actually are and whether or not they hold up, right? There's an aphorism from Beyond Good and Evil, same book that this is quoted from, where Nietzsche says, like, whenever I have an idea, I bite it first to see if it breaks, and if it breaks, then I know it's not any good. Like the first step is, can I destroy my own belief, right? And if you can, then it's probably on shaky ground. Let's go into the next one. Okay, so what does all this mean? We'll go through. Go ahead to the next. So I love this. There's Bruce Lee, right? not very famous for being a philosopher, but he actually did some philosophical writing. And one of his little things, his quotes actually, the stuff at the top, I wrote all that other junk. But your thoughts are wrong, right? So there's a TV show called Longstreet where Bruce Lee made an appearance and he's training some guy for a fight. And the guy is, he's got his eyes closed and he's supposed to track where Bruce is as he's walking around him. But the guy gets frustrated because he can't keep up with Bruce because he can't hear him. And eventually he's supposed to point out where Bruce is and he points in the wrong direction. And the immediate thing that Bruce says to him is, "Your thoughts are wrong." And that's been like kind of the point of this whole thing, is that you just stop assuming that your thoughts are correct. They're almost always wrong. So at least a little bit, right? And like, even if that other person over there who's really annoying, their thoughts are wrong, that doesn't mean that yours are right. You can both be wrong at the same time, okay? So again, I talked about thoughts being like dreams. They always seem to make sense while they're happening, but only after, when you try to articulate them, particularly in this case to write them down, do the inconsistencies and falsehoods appear. Let's go to the next slide. So, coming back to our philosophical definition of philosophy, it's a rational investigation of the truth. It is not the truth in itself, because it's not a dogma. It is not a system. It's not a doctrine. It's not a preference, right? It is a, let's say, methodology of trying to get at what we start out by admitting that we don't know. So start from a place of humble ignorance, and then, and only then, can you, let's say, find out what it is there is to learn about the world. The next one. So this is the last slide. There are a number of, let's say, subcomponents to philosophy that will be useful to know these terms, because they'll come up later. We've already talked about logic, right? It's that which sequences, that which follows, and not contradicting oneself. Got that one. Epistemology. Anyone heard of that one before?
The study of words.
That's etymology, is the study of words. Epistemology is like the study of coming to know a thing. How is it that certain ways of knowing are valid and some are invalid? That's epistemology, and we'll get more into that. Teleology. I like that one a lot. I use it a lot. Anyone know that one? Purpose. The function. What does a thing do? And that's relevant to philosophy when you start asking questions like, what is good? Right? Like, well, a good knife is a knife that serves its teleology, functions well. A good knife cuts well, because that's what a knife is for, right? You can start to see how that becomes important when you're writing. What are you writing for? What are you trying to do when you're writing? And then ethics. Ethics I care a lot about, actually. And at one point we'll talk about what I've been calling word sorcery, which are very clever means of lying. And we won't get into that now because I could talk about that too long and we're almost out of time. So let's go on to, I think, the last slide where I get to show some things. All right, so next time we're going to be talking about the philosophy of language, what language is, because we have to understand that before we can understand writing, because writing is in language. We talked a little bit about the relationship between language and thought, how you don't really think in words, you think in something other than words that then you articulate out in objective form in words. Get into more of that. And we'll also understand how thought affects and is affected by writing, which again we touched on a little bit throughout this lecture, how your writing is what makes your thoughts coherent, and that's how you check your thoughts. And then once you're able to do that, well, that's a feedback loop, right? Because then you can write down what you think, read what you think, correct that, rinse, repeat. Now you can read what other people think, and you can correct that, and the process goes on. Yeah, and if you guys enjoyed that, for you there out on the internet, mostly. I also have a novel, Wand Smoke Broken. It's a fantasy fiction novel. It covers actually a lot of the philosophical themes here. I read way too much philosophy. For someone who writes fiction, I should be reading more fiction, but I don't. So when you read the fiction, you get a bunch of philosophy. Who would have guessed? It's a lot of fun. Weird kind of fantasy fiction with a Western-esque literary twist. And lastly, I'm also a freelance editor. Particularly, I edit for fiction manuscripts, but I'll edit whatever. Like if you're a student and you want, like, hey, I need someone to proofread this essay before I turn it in because I care about my grades, here's $10. like, I don't know if it would be $10. It probably wouldn't even be that much, but I would do it, right? So you can check all that out at my website, wildislelit.com. I'm also across a bunch of social media. If you search up Marquise D. Little, and if you've gotten this far, you can figure out how to spell my name. All right, before we go, any questions from the audience at all? None? Like a usual college lecture. All right, guys, thank you so much for coming. Hopefully I didn't talk on too long, and I'll see you next time.